Welcome everybody to this keynote session on corporate purpose and the theory of the firm. Now this session will have a slightly different format than the ones we had yesterday, and even the one that is coming after. We are going to have two keynote speeches of around 25 minutes with Professor Bengt Holmström and Mr. Paul Polman, followed by a debate that will be moderated by Henri. I think we are going to see a very interesting debate, no, that will allow us kind of continue the one that was started by Colin Mayer and Lucy Singales yesterday, and as Jordi was mentioning before, kind of makes the backbone of what we are discussing into this discussion. I think we are going to see new perspectives in the impact of purpose on corporate governance today. And without further ado, Ben, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Jordi. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. I'm going to speak from the perspective of the theory of the firm. So there's not going to be very much practical advice, but I'm hoping that I will be able to plant some thoughts in your mind with regard to how to think about these very central and also very interesting issues. My main point is very simple. It's that I think the Coase-Friedman perspective on how various parties, various externalities are taken into account happens through maximizing profits, and that this perspective is not just descriptive as it has been interpreted, but actually it plays itself out right now. So that's my main point, is that the Coase-Friedman world or viewpoint is already at play, and it's a little more rare to hear that discussed. So let me just jump into my my talk by reflecting briefly on history. So another point which I think is important is that to recognize always when we talk about corporate governance is that it lives, and in my view it lives in the sense that, you know, we had stakeholder value in the 70s, and before we had shareholder value in the 80s to say up to now, and now we are essentially talking about stakeholder value plus, because these social issues are coming into the picture. In the shareholder value movement, the conflict was a lot about, you know, how do shareholders monitor management and boards, and how can they influence those decisions. Now we have sort of an expanding set of issues on the table that comes from these social preferences or social concerns. But the point is that I think when one looks at the long history of corporate governance, one sees that it adapts itself to what the world or what the economy and the society needs. It's not that we are steadily going towards some improving and better corporate governance and higher up the mountain. It's rather a pendulum where you go from stakeholder value to shareholder value and now back to stakeholder value. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's not, the point is just that new concerns and issues rise, and the system sort of adjust itself to this situation. So let me sort of first delve a little deeper into the Coase-Friedman world about why it is the case that by maximizing shareholder value, we are actually taking care of a lot of other players, also potentially social concerns. So, the idea is, I'm sure it has been expressed. I didn't hear all the talk yesterday, but I'm sure it has been expressed yesterday in various contexts. But I want to just reiterate it, that the main logic of the argument is that shareholders are residual claimants, and as residual claimants, whatever bad or good they do to the other parties, or patrons as they are sometimes called, that is workers, suppliers, customers, etc., they will get the returns from that. That is, they have a stake in how well they treat the workers, they have a stake in how well their products are received, and it will become clear they have also a stake in questions about social values and how well they respect those. So this residual claimant status is a very contractual point of view. In fact, all contract theory really is based on the idea that it doesn't matter whether I maximize my benefit subject to your constraints, or you maximize your benefit subject to my constraints, my utility constraints. It's all the same. Either way, it leads to basically maximizing the total pie. And this is something that students have actually quite a hard time initially understanding. It doesn't matter who maximizes and who is sort of placing constraints. The constraints basically come from exiting. So the key feature is that the key requirement, there's a set of requirements, but a very key requirement is that the other party has to be able to go and find some alternative. And that defines what the constraint is. So that's a very Coasian way of saying what Friedman said, is that we max the pie and we split it up. And of course, the splitting up requires bargaining, and bargaining is sometimes very costly. So in that sense, in practice, it does matter who decides. But I'm coming to that just in a second. I want to underline one thing is, in order for this whole mechanism to work, it's absolutely crucial that the firm is maximized. In order for shareholders to care about everybody, it has to maximize its own wealth. If it's indifferent towards its own wealth, this whole system breaks down. So it's far from, destroying or becoming careless about others. You care about others exactly when you actually care about your own profit. And this point is also very often sort of forgotten in this discussion. So management incentives need to be strong and not weak in order for caring about others. There's a deeper point that Henri Huntsman, who was my colleague at Yale, made. This argument, but I just said it already, but this argument that shareholders maximize and therefore automatically, so to speak, take care in their self-interest of the other parties, that argument actually could be made by any patron. So we could make just the same argument, it seems, that workers maximize their wealth subject to investors having a minimum requirement of some sort or another. So it raises the question, why aren't workers in charge? This argument, we are just assuming investors are in charge because we call them owners, but they are actually worker-owned companies where investors are not the owners. And there are cooperatives where investors are not owners. There are actually tons of various variety of organizations that are not investor-owned companies or joint stock companies. So the question is, what's so special? Why is it that this joint stock company has become so successful? And one is, of course, that they have access to capital, and it is the they getting capital for worker operated firms tends to be rather complicated. It has to be debt. Debt is inflexible, so there are risk issues. Same with cooperatives. That's one argument. But the key argument I want to raise here is that it is that investors of all these various patrons, investors are the most homogeneous of them all. That is, they have pretty aligned interest as is, and especially so if they can sell and buy their shares. So they are interested in money, or they are interested in wealth, let's call it that, way, because that's the way we are talking about. So contrast that to some worker-owned company or something like that, and you realize that workers have all sorts of other interests. So it's a very heterogeneous group, whereas investors are very homogeneous by comparison. There are other issues, workers can exit, provided they can exit, they can exit. So their exit rights can be exercised much more cheaply than can voice. So that's Henri Hansman's, I think, absolutely profound insight, that this homogeneity is one of the main strengths of companies. And those who are familiar with family firms know that family firms where you cannot trade shares, for instance, you create immediately heterogeneity, and you create immediately various problems, potential problems, at least how it's going to be run, because people have very different interests. So I'm mentioning this Hansman thing because that I want to bring it up in the context of Hart and Zingale's proposal that shareholders should be given voting rights. And I'm basically very skeptical to the idea that you should be given voting rights, exactly because of Hansman's argument. I think one of the strongest cases against giving them voting rights is that then we are bringing, especially about, say, social issues and so on, you are bringing in a strong heterogeneity into a group that is actually anonymous and pretty homogeneous. So another loss you have is that if you bring in voting rights, sort of voting about issues, should we do X, should we do Y, as good as it sounds, should Walmart investors should be asked, do they want to sell weapons in Walmart stores? That sounds, like it's a good idea to ask them. But if you start asking your shareholders, what they want, you are really destroying one of the most valuable features of the whole idea of an investor-owned company, which is I don't need to know who I'm joining when I'm buying shares or taking a stake in the company. And I don't need to, I stay anonymous, and I don't need to worry about the uncertainties that come from not knowing who they are, or, in the future, suddenly they get excited about something I don't like, and so on. These are very familiar issues for cooperatives, say housing cooperatives. It's kind of risky to go into and buy a New York cooperative apartment. You need to know who the other people are in that building. And this no need to know who the other investors are and maintaining is really a critical feature. So what they are bringing back in some sense, I'm maybe interpreting extremely, but what they are bringing back, if you go the Hart-Zingale's way, is that you are actually destroying this heterogeneity, or going back to these tensions that come from that. So the tensions that come from exercising voice. So that's, let me now then go and talk about how the social concerns get integrated in today's world, which still is kind of we haven't really changed the corporate governance today. How have firms responded to it, and how have investors responded? So we know that firms today, any self-respecting firm will have a statement about how green it is and how socially concerned it is and so on. No firm will just say, I don't care about these issues and we are just maximizing profits. They realize that maximizing profits actually does affect their firm value, and that's why they are putting it into the statement. It's not because they are thinking they want to be intrinsically socially concerned. It is what the movement that has come around and the pressure that comes from consumers, comes from social media. I think the social media plays a very big role in this, that it has sort of popped up now. And of course, the issues are tremendously important. There's pollution, there is environmental issues, there's gender issues, there's any number of issues that are critically important for society today. And firms have responded to them by expressing these issues. I think many of them, by the way, are genuine. I think Paul in his talk underline that point. Colin Mayer said it's mostly verbiage. I think verbiage matter a lot when one is a leader and tries to lead a firm. And as I said, Paul will testify to that fact, I'm sure. So investors, I have been to a couple of meetings with investors, institutional investors, commenting on or listening to them. And what I learned from that is that one reason they are certainly very concerned about ESG. It has been on the agenda now for a decade. My sense is that they are worried about it mainly because they see a lot of potential risk. We are talking about social media. Things can really quickly blow up. We are talking about days. You take a misstep and the social media catches you. That can really upend even big corporations, billion-dollar corporations, and they can, within days or maybe even within hours, they can lose massive amounts of value. So I think this seems to be one thing that the institutional investors are worried about. So they also think of this as a win-win. They think that if we are concerned, if the firm is concerned about these social issues, that's going to improve the value and protect against these risks that I talked about. I don't get the sense that they see a big trade-off. So win-win is, of course, the easy case. That's a no-brainer, so to speak. So that's why they are doing it. If you ask them, would you give up value in exchange for doing something socially good? They are either much more hesitant or they just don't see a trade-off. They just see that, what is socially good is actually good for the company. So I'm not sure that's because they are not thinking through it carefully or what is at stake. It could be also that their clients, are actually unwilling to give up money in exchange for sort of really paying something for investing in green or something like that. Let me just again repeat, companies massively already do good in this sense. But the question is, do they go beyond win-win and actually reduce the benefits of the shareholders in exchange for some social concern? I think I have not seen really any evidence of that. So my point here is an important one. You see that this is Friedman Coase at work, not in a prescriptive sense, but it is actually in a descriptive sense. What's happening right now is exactly the mechanism that Friedman was talking about. And so it's, in that sense, it's not an issue. I mean, there is an issue of is it good or bad, but using Friedman, this is I say Friedman, but really the man behind it is Coase, and another Nobel Prize winner, really a giant in the field of contract theory. So the question is this a good or a bad thing? And so I think I don't have a stand on whether it's a good or bad thing, but I am skeptical on moving very quickly into the changing the corporate governance. I mean, Colin Mayer's speech was, I have to admit, it was provocative. I love provocative talks, but it didn't provoke me in the direction he had in mind. I think, going and wholeheartedly changing capitalism. In fact, Luigi said the same. It seems utterly unwarranted at this stage. Let's see, is my view, how the thing plays itself out. On the margin, I think there are things one can do, and I think a key dimension in which I would look for improvements in corporate governance, given that I don't see sort of a structural change, if you wish, is actually to change the information structure. I think there's a need for information. So, what is socially good? What is, what are the ways in which we can measure it is a really big issue. And it's not obvious to me that some social interest groups and, be that Greta Thunberg or so whoever else, catches the interest of people. That's a pretty blunt mechanism, this social media. And I think there's wisdom of the crowd, but there's also, let's call it stupidity of the crowd, or they go to extremes, or they overlook many of that. It's not a balanced view you necessarily get from the market. So in that sense, I'm not with Friedman, is that when you take into account these pressure groups that organize themselves spontaneously, and they are not consumers, or they are not directly paying for something. Consumers are a reliable feedback mechanism, but political talk and movements are less so, I would argue. And so therefore the key would be to somehow get more and better information into this process, and maybe that way we may end up actually changing some of the corporate governance structure in order to improve that. Also, institutional investors have a role to play. So I'm looking for, there's a need for new information, a new kind of information. We have the checklist, we have the information that companies provide in the annual reports and so on. It's a little bit like we probably have rating agencies. I don't know this field or the recent movements in the field, but I imagine rating agencies are coming along, like the IESE was in the 90s and 2000. The IESE provided its own pressure on the corporation and told shareholders how they should, or suggested to shareholders how to vote on things. So I would imagine seeing those rating agencies that would say, company X doesn't look so good, company Y looks very good, and so on and so forth, maybe creating specific measures like financial rating agencies. There is, of course, always the concern of having a narrow group evaluating. People will, if somebody becomes big like ISS, people will start looking at that rating because everybody else is looking at that, and it becomes the norm. And doesn't mean it's the best norm or best rating, but it's just that puts us on the same page. And there's a risk that you get sort of an imbalance in this respect, again, on political issues, but that are very difficult to use. So another way of saying it is I'm worried about sort of the court of public opinion being too strong or too biased. That said, when I have been around the world before this pandemic, I talk to young students, and it is unbelievable how interested young people are in going beyond profit and trying to measure value created, for the environment especially, but also various social other issues, inequality, and so on. So they are young students, PhD students or potential PhD students. Many of them express that that's what they want to do in their doctoral studies or in their thesis writing. They want to create a better measure of total social value. Let me sort of, I'm getting towards the close, but let me say that first of all, in general, artificial intelligence, blockchain, these new digital technologies, I think, have the opportunity, has shown that they have the possibility to actually create much more reliable and trustworthy data. So blockchain in particular is trustworthy, but if you look at, actually I would look at China, take a company I know well, which is Ant Financial, that is Alibaba. They are very socially concerned because Jack Ma, I think, has his whole life been socially concerned, mainly about education, but also other things. So Alibaba has a big program where they are planting trees in desert, and I don't know the current numbers. We are talking about really big, massive investments in green forests, mainly in China, and so they leverage the AI, and they can monitor, sort of what to trust and what not to trust in this sense, and how to check, how to collect information from consumers and people who play their games and so on from the platform, and how to infer from that what they should be doing and what they are thinking. So they have a game, by the way, on greenery, which they use as sort of a way of collecting both data and indications of where to go. There is a Finnish company. I'm from Finland, so I have to advertise. It's a startup called Upright, that's led by a energetic woman, Anno Nieminen, and I urge you to go and look at her page. But she has a little different view. She's trying to assess, with the help of AI, from a mass of companies and documents, what really is the net impact of certain things like eating a hamburger or drinking from a plastic bottle and so on. And then so we are talking about, I think she said to me that she has 44,000 companies that the AI has sort of scanned. No person will go through 44,000 companies. Go and scan it, and from that, from actually millions of scientific articles, or hundreds of thousands at least, also infer how these valuations are being made and impact environment, health, social, and education. So she has a system where a company, or actually institutional investors are her main clients, will go and look to figure out that, how is McDonald's on this scale? What's the net impact in terms of cost, social cost measured, and they can put their own weights on environment, health, social, education, or even more detailed things in order to sort of assess what they think this impact is. This is all, by the way, they are using just mainly public information, so they are not stealing anywhere anything. But investors like it, institutional investors like it, and some companies also like it because they want to know what impact they have from their activities, and it impacts, how they also want to change in the hope of getting more value for the company. Of course, also doing good. So Paul will talk about the tremendous potential of leveraging social concerns among workers within the company in the form of a purpose to actually incentivize these people better. Let me just say that I read not all, but some of the material Paul had. My interpretation of what he's going to speak about, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of trying to jump ahead of this, is that actually Paul's message is really selling that leveraging social issues is good for the company too. That also is very much in the Friedman realm. That is, it's good for the company. That's just what Friedman said. Hearing about others is good for the company. And so that, as I said, was my main theme in this talk. And let me give some final words. Don't read this adherence to Friedman as me saying I'm cold-hearted, I just don't care about these social issues. On the contrary, I care a lot about these social issues. I'm just saying that the mechanism of getting to it is complicated, it's difficult. And this Friedmanian sort of world that's interpreted as normative, I think as it has played itself out, there are flaws for sure, but one shouldn't dismiss it wholeheartedly, because it is a very powerful driver. Just like Adam Smith said that the market economy is when we maximize our own utility, we maximize everybody's. That message I would stick with and not be willing to give up very quickly. So I wouldn't rush to big changes. I would interpret, wait for the more data. But at the margin, I think there are many things one can do to even better improve this mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Paul, is your turn. The virtual floor is yours.
I'm just taking frantic notes as Ben talked, and I really appreciate his perspective, which really comes with deep thought and deep understanding of our economic system. And I can relate to quite a lot of it in a perfect market. And if we would live in that, the systems are designed to give us what we deserve. And right now we need to link what Bengt has said with great passion, conviction, and deep knowledge, by the way, to the realities of the market, and then have a discussion about what needs to evolve, what doesn't need to evolve. I agree, we don't need to break everything to recreate what is needed, but I would also argue that what we currently have isn't quite working. And that's probably the most important thing, that we start with that, which is the reality check. I'm trained as an economist. I've unfortunately forgotten most of it, but what is very clear is when a little anecdote, when I graduated from the university in the Netherlands, my father didn't have much money. He worked in a factory, had 6 kids, and thanks to the Dutch government, I could get my education, and I'm still grateful for that. But he gave me a little plaque that I still have, a little porcelain thing was what he gave me. And I wondered at that time why he gave it to me, and actually didn't appreciate it so much. But I have it in my drawer, and I open it quite often when I'm at my desk. And it simply said in Dutch, an economist is someone who doesn't know it either. And what he was trying to tell me was, we operate always with a little bit of a sense of humility or humanity or modesty as we attack these issues. I come from the actual practitioner side or of the business side. And what I see right now, unfortunately, is that things are not quite working the way we had anticipated it. I would argue not if Milton Friedman was right or wrong, because the man did his best, came from a perspective, lived in the US, which had another vision of how a world should function than perhaps some of us that grew up in different places in Europe. And he was in a different time period. He was at a period when governments were functioning, was in a period when the planetary boundaries were not so transparent. Now we've done a tremendous job, without any doubt, lifting so many people out of poverty over the last few decades, more than at any time in history. It's actually a good time to be born. People live longer, healthier lives, have more possibilities. You'd love to be young in spirit and physically in today's world. But the reality is, the way that our economic system has provided the growth is simply not sustainable. We cannot have endless growth on a finite planet. This year, Earth's Overshoot Day was August 22nd, which means that every day after that, we use more resources than the planet can replenish. We're actually stealing from future generations. Our climate change is projecting to over 3%, which gives us enormous cost. Our inequality is going up. The COVID crisis is just a symptom of our shortcomings. It shows really, above all, that we cannot have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. So what is happening is, with governments, with the financial market, with business, that we, despite the best will, despite mechanisms that we have put in place that were supposed to work, we are not giving the desired results. A world where too many people feel they're not included or can't participate will ultimately rebel against itself. A world that doesn't have an inclusive growth and a sustainable growth will not be there for the longer period of time. We've done in the last 40 years more damage to our planet than in the whole history of the planet combined. 68% of species have disappeared. About 1 million more are about to disappear. Climate change will create 1 billion people in refugees. Our poverty levels goes up again, and the numbers go on. So I start from the practical side. What is wrong here, and what should we adjust? It doesn't make any sense for me to have discussions around capitalism or not capitalism. But what is important to me is, just like Franklin Roosevelt created the New Deal and pivoted the United States to a period of prosperity, I think we're in desperate need for a New Deal as well. And whilst many of the things that Bengt said will work for responsible companies, will work with responsible leaders, will work with responsible governments. Unfortunately, we don't have enough of them, so that collectively the numbers don't add up, as I'm just explaining. Our global governance situation, when Milton Friedman was born, he relied on very responsible governance codes. And these responsible governance codes made companies behave responsibly. Right now, we have governments that cannot even sit around the table on the basic issues of how we treat people with COVID, or what we should be doing as we travel around, or how we should help countries that are still left behind or actually suffering from things that we've induced upon them. Global governance is broken. These are institutions that have been developed about at the time of Bretton Woods in the 40s, 70 years ago, and never been adjusted. No institution would survive. Any company that is listening to this will have had 10, 15, 20 different strategies. The same thing with the financial market. The shareholder primacy theories, there's nothing wrong with that in theory, but it just doesn't work in practice anymore. We have too many different shareholders that have too many different opinions now in the multitude of possibilities of maximizing return. We've put far more money in the world than when Milton Friedman was there. We've created financial instruments of 500-600 trillion in a world that has a real economy that is less than 100 trillion. And all that money is chasing returns and becoming shorter and shorter term. We've also created the distance between what the real shareholder is and what the agents are that are operating for the shareholders. And there is a discrepancy between what they are seeking. There's a discrepancy between the opinions that they have about what they expect from companies. So this mismatch is confusing. And that mismatch is happening at the board level as much as it is happening at the shareholder level, as much as it is happening in the broader corporate governance. So we need to evolve. That's all I'm saying. And we need to evolve with a sense of urgency, because climate change doesn't wait, nor does the planet wait. And it's sending us invoices. And business that understands that they need to pivot their role will be businesses that will be successful. I don't talk about maximizing shareholder return because it's a real discussion about what the time frame is. We will maximize all stakeholders' return if we have more room and can work for the longer term. If it's just about maximizing shareholder return and we have a time frame that is being put upon us by the financial market, increasingly, many CEOs will say, on a shorter and shorter term basis, then the system is going to explode. I know, as Bengt rightfully said, it wasn't designed that way, but it certainly is behaving that way. And if you doubt that, 95% of the profits that companies made in the US in the last 10 years went to the shareholders and the CEOs. Nothing was invested. The airlines have done a combined 95% of their free cash flow was given back to share buybacks over the last 10 years. Now they're desperately asking for help. We simply haven't invested. We've not invested in our people either. If you look at the social network and how much that is broken, that has become clear in terms of COVID, we have a job to do. Nor have we created a very inclusive economy. That's the responsibility, I think, that we have collectively as citizens to make this work. A company can only long-term survive, not by maximizing the shareholder value, because no company has been invented really in its origins for shareholder value. Lord Lever didn't invent the company to maximize his own value. No, he was driven by the issues of hygiene in Victorian Britain, when 1 out of 2 babies didn't make it past year 1. He was driven by the fact that he wanted to invent a product that addressed that. In his case, Lifebuoy or Sunlight bar soaps. In fact, the man never really had money. He was always spending it ahead of earning it. He built the houses for his workers before he had the plant fully running. He introduced pension plans in the UK. When they went to war, he guaranteed their jobs back, but not only that, he paid the wives because the men were gone. Not surprising they had the highest number of volunteers. He believed in something that was called shared prosperity. It's not about maximizing any individual stakeholder. Many in this world don't have an opportunity to ever become a shareholder. It is a duty and an obligation for any of the responsible citizens in whatever function you are, even if you run a company, to ensure that you have a net positive impact in this world and that you optimize because of your presence, optimize the return for all your stakeholders. And interestingly, the shareholders would actually be much better off than they are currently. Let's look at shareholder primacy and short-termism. The number of publicly traded companies over the last 4 decades has gone down from over 8,000 in the US to 4,000. I know there's a new economy developing. I know some companies stay private, but we're depriving a lot of people of value creation. We're depriving a lot of people of potentially pensions by not being able to benefit from dividends of these companies. Why are these companies disappearing? The length of a publicly traded company in the US used to be 67 years when I was born. It is now less than 17 years. We're driving these companies into the ground. It's not that everything moves faster and companies should have a shorter life. You'd be agreeing with me that this delta is beyond what is normal. And frankly, most of that has happened in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Driving companies into the ground, taking companies out of the economic system, and then we make them, then we create leaders. Let's talk about the leaders. The average tenure of a CEO is now less than 4.5 years. No wonder they're heavily incentivized to the shorter term and make the maximum of it when they're there. No wonder they're catering to the noises of the shareholders who make the biggest noise and try to please them. No wonder that they then take these funds that they can liberate out of companies for the short-term kick of adrenaline that we can give to any company. It was very clear to me when I was in Unilever, when we got a hostile takeover bid by Kraft Heinz, that these economic systems that are both legal and both acceptable clearly in the world, that they are so contrary and conflicting. And ultimately, if we don't wake up to these differences and address these differences, we're going to all sink in the same boat that we're in, the boat of humanity and our global boat. A system that focuses on the few billionaires versus the billions of people that you serve. A system that is only focused on creating value versus looking at the values that you need to create these values, the value itself. A system that only goes for profit instead of purpose-driven systems that produce profit. These are fundamental differences in moral leadership, in standards that are needed on how we run these companies. And frankly, our current governance system, once more, is not conducive to drive that behavior in individuals. In an ideal world, that might be the case, but we don't live in an ideal world. The systems changes we need to drive are horrendous. We need to move the financial markets to the longer term to provide the space to address these issues like climate change, poverty, food security, that take far more time. We need to decarbonize this global economy. I think the majority of the world has now understood the devastating effects of climate change, probably the most existential issue that we have in the history of humanity. And we've never been able to do that. We need to create a circular, or what I would call a regenerative economy. Only 9% of what we produce is actually reused. The rest is thrown away, incinerated, or indeed ends up in the oceans. That's a bizarre system that shareholder value focus is producing right now. And then finally, our income inequality. The system is very clear. It's working for a few, but it's clearly not working for many. And once more, anytime when too many people feel that they're not included or benefit from the system will ultimately rebel against the system. You switch on CNN, and despite COVID, we have people in the countries, in 50 countries right now. If it weren't for COVID, we have the whole world demonstrating. So the issue is first and foremost one of leadership. We've never been so forewarned about what is going to happen. And frankly, we've never been so forearmed to do something about it. And for most of these human challenges that we have, that put the future of humankind at stake, we have the solutions. We know how to produce food without cutting down the forest. We know how to produce toilets, yet 1.5 billion people still do open defecation. We know how to create wealth and could also ensure that it is a little bit more distributive. So all these things are known. So the key issue that we're missing is willpower. Itself a renewable resource, but do we really care? And do we have the right leaders? If I look at the top companies in the world, we looked at that recently, 40% of them have had 3 or more CEOs in the last 10 years. What are the boards doing? Who are they selecting? These are critical questions we need to answer. We don't have the right leadership at the scale that we need. The second thing we need is to start measuring what we treasure. I believe in systems that you can direct people by bringing the attention to them. But if you only bring the attention to financial capital, people will optimize financial capital. But if you also bring attention to social and environmental capital, then I think capitalism is very well placed to optimize that. When I was born, once more, 85% of the value of a company was explained by what is the current accounting methods. Now it's only 18%. Yes, we've moved to a service economy, and yes, there are some other things, but the intangibles that we call the 85% now of a market value of a company are very tangible. We can measure culture, we can measure responsibility in the value chain, we can measure treatment of people. And collectively, we're just not scoring very high. But interestingly, companies that treat people better, that pay beyond the median wage, that internalize the challenges of climate change, and have plans that treat their suppliers better in their value chains, they have better, more engaged workforces, they have better profitability, they are more innovative. But unfortunately, it doesn't come to us at the scale that we need it. So we have to force it. So we have to do the second thing next to leadership is to adjust our measuring system and include next to financial capital, environmental and social capital. And the third thing we need, unfortunately, is to solve the things that we all suffer from, and business gets the first hit if governments don't act and they're held accountable more and more. We need to form different forms of partnership to solve this. Businesses need to first and foremost work for the common good. They need to understand that by investing in others and making others better, they're also ultimately better off themselves as well. Henry Ford's simple thinking, but now amplified by a factor of millions for what this world currently needs. So we need companies that go together and work for far more collectively on these areas that should become pre-competitive, which basically relate to the future of mankind. If I could not get the global consumer goods industry together and stop deforestation, we're all going to pay the price. If I can't get the global consumer goods forum together and stop the issues of obesity, we're all having costs in our healthcare system that go out of proportion. Companies need to take responsibility of their total footprint in society, first and foremost, and ensure that that is positive, or at least work towards that. For that reason, CSR is really not good enough anymore. We cannot live anymore in a world where we just think that less bad is the standard. So these different partnerships are needed. And more importantly, these partnerships are needed now between the different stakeholders, because we have this gap in governance. If we don't put the people together at a critical mass asking for change, we don't get the ultimate change that is needed to make a system function, which is in governance, in policies, and in frameworks. We cannot solve climate change only with the 25% of companies that are now moving and have science-based targets. Nor can we change it if actually 100% of the companies get together. We also need the governments to be responsible and put policies in place that are conducive. And right now, we just don't have any movement or responsibility at scale that addresses these global issues. So business has another reason to step up. If businesses do that, become net positive, are taking responsibility of these bigger transformations even beyond their companies, and run their multi-stakeholder models, they're doing extremely well. For the first time, we see the financial market really waking up to ESG at a level we've never seen before. During COVID, more funds came in, and these funds were performing significantly better. But it didn't come from the financial market. It didn't come from them. They're jumping on it now because they see the financial opportunity. So you might say the free market works. No, it doesn't work, because they came far too late and not at the scale and intensity that we're needing. If the financial market would work and the shareholders would be responsible, why didn't they demand earlier from companies to tackle the issues of climate change, or to ensure that we had fair representation on our boards or in our management, or to take care of our people in the value chain instead of allowing slave labor, child labor, and all the other things. So it's this higher level of change that we now need to own, be responsible for if we are in a position to do something about, and ensure that we can bend the curve where needed, bend our corporate governance codes, bend the code of leadership, moral leadership that we need, bend the governments to move in the right directions. If we can do that collectively, we have a wonderful world to live in. If we fail to do that at this moment, we have failed humanity. So this is an incredibly important thing that we talk about. And that's why it's so important to put purpose smack in the middle of a company, because purpose comes from your values, your beliefs. That is the most important thing. And companies that are driven by that stronger purpose, really anchored in these strong values and beliefs, will be the companies that will succeed long term. And the ones that don't, we will all visit them in the graveyard of dinosaurs. I'll leave it there for the time being.
Paul,
Okay,
thank you,
Paul. Thank you, Paul. So we had two very interesting point of view. I think more complementaries that they look like.
Yes.
Just different mechanisms to get similar results. But now I give the word to manage this debate to Henri. Henri, the floor is yours for getting into the debate and closing the session.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John Enrique, and thank you, Bengt, and thank you, Paul. Those were extraordinary presentations, and don't expect me to try and look for the complementarity in them. I think that there's plenty of divisions there that we can try and exploit to have a really good debate. I thought it was fascinating that Bengt starts basically by making a very provocative address about, in a sense, that's in favor of the Coase-Friedman model of, albeit enhanced shareholder primacy. And it's funny to think that that is now provocative. You know, this was the established view, but it does sound interestingly provocative these days. And of course, Paul, in his remarks, made very clear the fact that there is a failure of government here, and that I think, as he put it, it's up to companies to put purpose smack in the middle of this. So what I wanted to basically ask you a question each to start off with, and they're very related, so I'll put them together. I mean, basically, Bengt, you in your remarks, you made clear that this sort of enhanced shareholder value idea is now part of the times, that we've moved from a stakeholder to shareholder to now enhanced shareholder or stakeholder again. And I wondered if you could explain why you think that is, why that movement has happened. Is that, as Paul suggests, because there is this governance failure in the world and it's up to companies to step up to the plate? And if that is the case, I would then like to ask Paul how you think that CEOs can address this without actually playing God, without actually saying, I know the answer to these problems, and setting the company's purpose around their own values rather than a longer term vision. So if you could both mull that one over together, I would really appreciate it. Should we start with you, Bengt?
Thank you, Henri. Yes. So let's just show, why did we leave shareholder value in the 70s, 80s? I think we have an understanding of that. The main reason was that that we needed to move capital from what I call sunset industries to sunrise industries, and in the US it came with takeovers, and it came with a stronger financial incentives. So there were massive amounts of mergers and acquisitions and restructuring, and that benefited for a singular focus on shareholder value. Why are we now seeing a shift back? So this just supports my view that they follow, whatever the society, so to speak, wants, or what is good for society. In the first order, the second move that you see now is that companies are looking at the cues provided by society and giving the indications. Paul spoke eloquently about all the problems in the world, and I agree with them, and I'm concerned about them just as Paul is, and it's not that I'm indifferent. But let me just remind you that there has been an incredible indifference to, say, environmental threats, not by companies alone, but by you and me and everybody. We have read about it, and we have read about it, and we have done nothing about it. Showing the social media's impact is Greta Thunberg. When she suddenly came on the scene, a lot changed. So I just don't see how a company can, just like Henri mentioned, how can a company, figure out that, or it could, but at large, how can we blame companies as saying they should really take the lead? I don't know where they would take the cue from, other than from the way society looks at it, and facts come along and so on. So Unilever was progressive, and I congratulate and admire Paul, but it's something that is, but Unilever has benefited greatly by going in that direction. So you saw where to invest, but not everybody sees where to invest.
No, I agree with that. And that's why it's moral leadership, in my opinion. And I'm not saying we had it or not. We made a lot of mistakes. But unfortunately, we are not blessed with that many. And if we're not blessed with that many, we have to provide other mechanisms to ensure that we drive in the right direction and not have to wait for Greta. The few industries that were continuously denying climate change, if we talk climate change as an example, I don't want to make this a climate change discussion, where the airlines and the car industry. Now the airlines and the fossil fuel industry, not surprisingly. So the fossil fuel industry stuck their heads in the sand. They've seen a 50% shareholder value depreciation in the last 2 years, whilst green energy has moved up with 50%, 60%. There are now companies in the Nordics that do wind and solar that have a bigger market cap than Exxon. You didn't hear the investors, you didn't hear the management. In fact, the management was out there actively boycotting under shareholder primacy, actively boycotting via trade associations and others, the whole debate on climate change. Companies the airlines, the same thing. Now they need to be built out. All they're asking for in governments across the world is to reduce their emission obligations. In fact, they had negotiated very well to be excluded from the Paris Agreement. How can we exclude some industries and expect to tackle the issue? So we miss responsible management at scale. I can't help it. It's a reality. So then we need to intervene and think how to do that. There are a few things that investors need, because inherently the bulk of the investors want returns longer term for their pensioners. And I believe if we get out of the debate of short term and long term, a lot more would be common. We need to long-term optimize. I don't like the word maximize, long-term optimize. For Unilever, it is not profit that counted. It's the long-term cumulative growth of the company that counted. That builds the share price. I could easily maximize profit and kill the company over a 5 or 10 year period. Sadly, be a hero CEO, but I wouldn't have done the company nor society a favor. So what we are talking here about is long-term optimization. So what the financial market at scale wants is they want a longer term return for their pensioners, but they also increasingly understand that they need to be sure that the pensioners can live in the world that they retire in. So until now, the interest was less because we have not been able to explain the value creation model. There are very few CEOs who seek out the right investors or go to the investor base and explain. There are about 600 different companies that do ESG measures. They're in all different directions. It's a lot of greenwashing in there or lack of clarity. So creating uniform standards across asset owners, asset managers, and asset creators is an absolute must. The second thing the CEOs can do is walk the talk themselves. Look at their own compensation system. Look at how they behave in the company. I stopped quarterly reporting the day I came. I stopped giving guidance the day I came. I moved compensation system to the long term for everybody because I could see the rest were playing games and we were living in the foo-foo economies, trying to hold ourselves accountable versus targets that we put out there and losing complete reality, understanding of the realities in which we were operating. We can also work with our boards and be sure that our boards understand what their fiduciary duties are. It is a fallacy in most jurisdictions in the world to think that the fiduciary duties of the boards are only towards maximizing shareholder wealth. There's enough written about that and enough people that have looked at these jurisdictions. Even in the UK, where you have code in the company code 172C, makes it very clear what the responsibilities are to multiple stakeholders. It is now getting into European law because of what the Green Deal is trying to do and changing corporate governance. So working on your boards. I've heard many boards say, I work with quite a lot of boards on a daily basis, and I've heard many board members say, oh, the ESG, I don't want to get involved in. It's too much risk for me. First of all, you have to ask what board members are they? Are they helping the company or are they only protecting their own reputation or risk? But it's too much risk for me. I would argue that if the board members don't get involved in these fundamental issues that affect the company, then they put themselves at risk. Only 7% of the boards have people there that are climate competent. You would never run your audit committees like that. No shareholders asking for it. So we need to change things. That's all I'm advocating for. We need to change things a little bit at an accelerated pace to get the critical mass together to address these issues. Otherwise, we would never get there. We really would do our children a big disfavor.
And back to you, Bengt. A question on regulation. I mean, isn't it the role, to a certain extent, of regulators and governments to be handling this? And isn't there a risk, I suppose, that if companies convince governments that they've got the problem under control because they are driven by society, by pro-social purpose, that actually they are just fobbing off the regulators and the regulators will let them get away with what they want to do? I mean, that sounds cynical, but is there a risk that is what's going on here?
Oh, there absolutely is a risk. We have to be very mindful of that.
Can we just let Bengt? I can't actually see Bengt on my screen at this point.
Okay, so there is definitely a risk, and the regulatory system is highly imperfect, and again, but we look at taxation of CO2. It has its problems. I understood that Patrick Bolton talked about that. That's a mechanism that can be used. Economists have talked about it, but it's I don't see a role directly for. I see the channel as coming through ways. One is consumers, or three ways: consumers, public opinion, regulators, and then also, of course, institutional investors. Those have a big role. That's where the pressure should come from, and those people should be making sure that the companies are sort of informed about it. I have only admiration, Paul, for you that you saw these things well in advance, but I don't see it as fundamentally different from the insights that some companies always have had, who saw that the car industry will be big, or it falls in the category of foresight and some luck, I presume. So it's a combination. But I don't see that everybody should suddenly decide or see that it's matching. They are waiting to see what's happening. And my concern is that if you attack somehow forcefully corporate governance or see that as the main flaw, I would be ready to conclude that. But we are very much on the same page, you and me, with regard to information and assessment. But we both know how difficult it is to try to measure social impact of various kinds. But there are measures, and I think AI, my point was that AI, actually from looking at the upright company, you know, the AI is, and financial, AI is a remarkable tool these days to find out what's implicit to the rest of us, you know, is hidden, so to speak, from the rest of us. So I'm optimistic that this is changing. I think we are on the right track. You know, we are talking. It's wonderful to talk about it. I don't want to shove this aside. I just think the mechanism of, I call it still wealth maximization, the quotient mechanism. I think it is fundamental, you know, to the way the economy can work well, including taking into account. Let me just say one thing. You are right. I am with you on the short-termism, because financial markets, we have theories that show that if financial markets are sort of pricing everything right in the sense of efficient market hypothesis, they still may be making wrong decisions. So it's not, you know, to say that markets are efficient in an informational sense doesn't mean they make the right decision. This is a technical remark, but I'm saying just that no, not everything is right about just, you know, an efficient market even.
Can I just make a point there? I mean, I've been writing this week about Jeff Bezos at Amazon, and it's funny when you look at Unilever and its focus on the long term and its focus on the customer under Paul. It was really, in a sense, a template as well for what has happened at Amazon, and Amazon has done fantastically well as a result. And yet one looks at Amazon now and one thinks that's a fantastic company, but look at the social impact that it has on the side as well, in the form of the sort of desertification of high streets, etc. This brings to mind the question of trade-offs. And Paul, I would like to ask you, when you were talking to your board and you were measuring these impacts, I assume, how would you do that? I mean, how would you convey to your board that one particular impact was worth it, whereas another impact was not tolerable?
So it's very important to point out once more that you need to take responsibility as a company. And if I was a board, I would also hopefully expect that from the people running the companies, of your total footprint in society. It's very great to celebrate Amazon or Facebook or Google, but increasingly you see the backlash coming in that also actually risks tremendous shareholder value when you only take responsibility of a part of your model, but not of the total model. So if Facebook doesn't get involved in privacy issues or in hate speech or other things, then they're not fulfilling what I believe is their duties or responsibilities as a corporation towards society, because ultimately it's society that lets them be there, not the shareholders. The same with Amazon. Jeff Bezos only got interested in climate change and started moving when 8,000 employees threatened to walk out. That shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't have to threaten and walk out. On the terms of how do you drive legislation and how do you move these frameworks forward, I would argue you have to be realistic of where we are currently. And what it means is that we have to put coalitions together of the willing. The governments cannot do this alone because they don't have the knowledge and things move too fast. So when you get to these legislations that often have to be implemented at sectorial level, they need the best of these sectors that are responsible, and they only need 20, 30%. Unfortunately, we don't even have more in many sectors, to sit together, to work with civil society, to work with governments, and to work with the responsible parts of business of moving that forward. It's a very practical way, especially now that in many places democracy doesn't work. And the financial market, I would argue, doesn't work either. There are too many different interests that are now there in the financial markets. And that's one of the reasons why actually we don't see them stepping up. We've not seen them stepping up on the short-termism. We've not seen them stepping up on climate change. We're forcing them now to step up. When does the financial market get interested? When they see that they can get a return.
Oh, can I interrupt you a second? I just want to end with one question from the panel. One question for the panel, which comes from the audience. And it just brings us back to Kraft Heinz, I guess. And it's just, do you think that the private equity crowd that are now the drivers of the corporate world care about the topic that we're discussing? And could you just, we only have a minute or two, so could you just, both of you, give a quick answer to what that means? What do you think about that?
Do you want me to start?
Yes, why don't you start, Bengt?
Okay, so I would worry about that in the sense that there isn't the feedback I'm talking about necessarily, but I want to point out that the rise of private equity has to do with regulations, in my view. That is, it has to do with many things, but one of the things is they escape the burdens of regulation and various kinds of reporting problems there. Can I just pitch in one quick thing about to complement what you said about Amazon and so on? It's interesting that the most valuable companies today are the companies that have singularly not looked at what the market says. Steve Jobs never talked to investors. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they have as the objective the best search machine and so on. So it's funny that those who looked away from money actually have been worth the most. So it goes along with, in some sense, what Paul said. So I find that very interesting.
I think on that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to. I just wanted to take find a point of consensus, which we just found, but we've hit deadline. So I think we're going to have to call an end to a fantastic session. I don't want to rain on a lot of the really interesting and positive work about purpose and ESG, but I think it's actually interesting, just bearing in mind the point that we've been talking about regarding the tech giants, that so much of the value in ESG, in the rise in ESG values in the course of this year has come from those tech companies, and those tech companies are now under attack for market dominance and other privacy issues, etc. So it is an incredibly complicated area. And I would just say that to hear two such distinguished, in the true sense of the word, speakers explain their points of view on this with such clarity and with such intensity of vision, it's a tremendous privilege to be here on the panel. And can I thank Paul and Bengt very much indeed for your contributions.
Thank you. Thank you, Henri, and thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thanks.
We could have carried on talking for ages, but let me just tell you from here, there is you can go purposefully and have what in Europe is tea, but I guess in America is something else. In Asia would hopefully be a late night drink. And if you could be back in 15 minutes, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.